Margaret Hale thought she'd buried her heart alongside her family years ago. She'd chosen isolation over pain, silence over risk. But on one merciless summer afternoon, when a dust-covered stranger appeared at her door holding a dying baby, everything changed. That single knock shattered years of carefully constructed solitude. What began as one night of reluctant compassion spiraled into something Margaret never saw coming, a choice between the safety of loneliness and the terrifying possibility of family. This is the story of a woman who lived alone for years, until she didn't. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast canvas of golden grass that rippled like ocean waves beneath the relentless summer sun. Heat rose in shimmering curtains from the parched earth, distorting the horizon into liquid mirages that promised water, but delivered only disappointment. In the middle of this harsh expanse, where the land met sky without interruption, stood a weathered cabin, modest, sturdy, and utterly alone. Margaret Hale stood at her kitchen window, watching the heat dance across her small garden. The tomato plants drooped despite her morning watering, their leaves curling inward against the assault of afternoon sun. She'd lost 2 cucumber vines already this week. The well was holding, but each bucket she drew seemed lighter than the last, as if the earth itself was drinking deep before sharing. At 43, Margaret had learned to read the plains like some people read books. The way grass bent told her wind direction. The color of the sky at dawn predicted the day's temperature. The sound of silence, and there were different kinds of silence out here, could mean peace or warn of approaching storms. Today's silence felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved away from the window. The cabin's interior offered little relief from the heat, but at least the thick log walls provided shade. She'd opened every window that morning, creating cross breezes that barely stirred the air. Her routine rarely varied: morning chores, afternoon mending, evening reading by lamplight. The sameness didn't bother her. She'd chosen this isolation deliberately, carefully, after the fever took Thomas and the children 5 years ago. The memories lived in specific objects scattered throughout the cabin. Thomas's tobacco pipe on the mantel, untouched. Little Emma's rag doll tucked in the corner of the bedroom, its button eyes still bright. James's hand-carved horse on the kitchen shelf, frozen mid-gallop. Margaret never moved these things. She dusted around them, acknowledging their presence while refusing to dwell on what they represented. Her neighbors, the Hendersons to the east, the Weavers to the south, had tried to help at first, brought casseroles and sympathy, offered prayers and practical assistance. But Margaret had withdrawn into herself like a turtle into its shell, politely but firmly refusing their kindness. Eventually, they'd stopped coming. She saw them at the general store in town once a month when she went for supplies, exchanged brief pleasantries, then returned to her solitary existence. She preferred it that way. Solitude was predictable. Solitude couldn't be taken from you because you'd chosen it first. Solitude meant never watching someone you loved struggle for breath while you stood helpless, never hearing a child cry out in fevered delirium, never feeling a husband's hand grow cold in yours as death claimed what medicine couldn't save. The cicadas began their afternoon chorus, a wall of sound that seemed to press against the cabin walls. Margaret had grown so accustomed to their screaming that silence would have startled her more. She settled into her rocking chair with a basket of mending, 2 shirts with torn elbows, 3 pairs of socks with holes worn through the heels. Her needle moved with practiced efficiency, each stitch neat and purposeful. Outside, the sun climbed toward its apex. Heat waves shimmered across the yard, making the chicken coop waver like it was painted on water. Her 6 hens had taken refuge in the shade beneath their roost, barely moving except to occasionally ruffle their feathers. Even the rooster had abandoned his usual strutting in favor of staying still. Margaret's mind wandered as her hands worked. She thought about the well, calculating how many more weeks of this heat it could sustain. She thought about the fence on the north side that needed repair before winter. She thought about the letter from her sister in Kansas City that had arrived 2 weeks ago, still unanswered, suggesting, again, that Margaret come live with her family. She wouldn't go. The city would suffocate her worse than any heat. All those people, all that noise, all those opportunities for connection, and therefore loss. No. Better to stay here, where the only sounds were wind and cicadas, where the only voice she heard was her own, where the only heartbeat she felt was hers alone. The knock, when it came, was so unexpected that Margaret's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of blood welled up, bright red against her weathered skin. She stared at it for a moment, disoriented, wondering if she'd imagined the sound. But then it came again. 3 firm raps against the wooden door, deliberate and urgent. Margaret set aside her mending and stood slowly, her heart rate quickening in a way that annoyed her. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but visitors were rare enough to warrant caution. She moved to the window and peered out carefully. A man stood on her porch, his back to the sun so his face was shadowed. He was tall and lean, wearing dusty travel clothes that had seen better days. A hat hung from his hand rather than sitting on his head. But what caught Margaret's attention, what made her breath stop in her chest, was the small bundle he cradled against his chest. A baby. Even from here, even through the window, she could see the child's tiny hand dangling limply from the blanket wrapping. The man knocked again, then called out, his voice rough with dust and desperation. "Please, I know someone's home. I can see movement. Please, my son needs help." Margaret's hand was on the door handle before she'd consciously decided to open it. Some instincts ran deeper than self-preservation, deeper than chosen isolation. She pulled the door open and was immediately struck by the wall of heat that rushed in, carrying with it the smell of dust, sweat, and something else. The sweet, worrying scent of fever. Up close, the man looked worse than she'd thought. His face was burned dark by the sun, but beneath the tan his skin had an unhealthy pallor. Dust coated him from head to foot, clinging to his clothes, his hair, settling into the lines around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, gray and bloodshot, looked at her with such desperate hope that Margaret felt something crack in the careful walls she'd built. "My horse," he said, his voice cracking, "collapsed about 5 miles back. Been walking since dawn. My son, he's burning up. I just need shade. Water. Just one night, please." He adjusted his hold on the bundle, and Margaret caught a glimpse of a small face, maybe 2 years old, flushed with fever, eyes half closed, lips slightly parted as he struggled with shallow, rapid breaths. Margaret's training as a mother, dormant for 5 years, roared to life with shocking intensity. She stepped back without thinking, opening the door wider. "Inside," she said, "quickly, before you let all the heat in." The man stumbled across the threshold as if his legs barely remembered how to work. Margaret shut the door behind him and gestured toward the sitting area where her rocking chair sat beside a small couch. "There, near the window where there's a breeze." He sank onto the couch with a sound that was half exhale, half sob of relief. The baby stirred slightly at the movement, whimpering, a thin, reedy sound that made Margaret's chest tighten. "Water?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Please, both of us. It's been—" "I can see what it's been," Margaret said, filling a cup from her water pitcher. She brought it to him, watching as he drank greedily, water spilling down his chin in his haste. When he'd drained it, she refilled the cup and brought it back. "Slower this time," she instructed. "And the baby? How long has he had the fever?" The man looked down at his son with such raw pain that Margaret had to look away. It was too familiar, too close to memories she'd locked away. "Started yesterday morning," he said. I hoped it was just the heat. But last night he was worse. I've been trying to reach Thomasville. There's a doctor there. But my horse—" He trailed off, and Margaret didn't need him to finish. She knew what happened to horses in this heat when they were pushed too hard. The animal had probably given everything it had before its heart simply gave out. "Let me see him," Margaret said, surprising herself. The man hesitated for just a moment, then carefully transferred the bundle to her arms. The weight was heartbreakingly light, and the heat radiating from the small body was alarming. Margaret unwrapped the blanket, too many layers for this weather, and found a little boy with dark hair matted to his head with sweat. His breathing was too fast, too shallow. His skin was dry despite the heat, which meant dehydration. His eyes flickered open at her touch, but didn't focus properly. She pressed her fingers gently to his throat, feeling his pulse racing like a trapped bird. "What's his name?" she asked. "Samuel," the man said. "Sam. He's 2 years and 4 months old." Margaret carried Samuel to the kitchen, grabbing a clean cloth along the way. She dampened it with cool water from the pitcher and began gently sponging his face, his neck, the inside of his wrists. "You need to get his temperature down," she said, speaking more to herself than the stranger. Slowly, though, not too fast. The man had followed her, hovering near the table. "I have some fever medicine in my pack, but he won't take it. He's barely conscious." "You carried a pack 5 miles in this heat?" Margaret asked, glancing at him with new assessment. He was stronger than he looked, then, or more desperate. Probably both. "Everything I own is in that pack," he said simply. Margaret nodded toward the door. "Where is it?" "Outside. I dropped it on the porch when I knocked." "Get it," she said, "and take off your hat and coat. You're half dead yourself from the look of you." He obeyed without argument, disappearing briefly and returning with a worn leather pack that he set on the table. While he shed his outer layers, Margaret continued her careful ministrations on Samuel, noting with some relief that his breathing seemed to ease slightly as his skin cooled. "The medicine," she said. The man dug through his pack and produced a small brown bottle with a handwritten label. Margaret recognized it, a standard fever reducer sold at most general stores. It wasn't particularly strong, but it was better than nothing. "We'll try again in a moment," she said. "Let me get him more comfortable first." She carried Samuel back to the couch and arranged him carefully, propping his head up slightly. The man watched every movement with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. "What's your name?" Margaret asked as she worked. Daniel Cross. "I'm Margaret Hale. This is my home, my land." "I saw the property markers about a mile back," Daniel said. "I wasn't sure if anyone actually lived out here. The cabin looked, quiet." "I like quiet," Margaret said, more sharply than she'd intended. "I don't mean to intrude," Daniel said quickly. "Truly, just tonight. Tomorrow, if Sam is stable enough, we'll be on our way. I have a brother in Thomasville. He's expecting us. Well, he was expecting us 3 days ago." Margaret glanced up at him. "You're 3 days late, and you're still trying to get there?" "I'm all Samuel has," Daniel said simply. The words carried a weight that needed no explanation. Margaret understood that weight. She'd carried a similar burden for the last weeks of her family's life, trying to be mother and nurse and prayer warrior all at once, and failing at all three. "The fever medicine," she said, pushing the memories away. "Let's try it now while he's a bit cooler." Together, they managed to get a few drops past Samuel's lips. He sputtered and tried to turn away, but enough went down to matter. Margaret wiped his chin and adjusted the damp cloth on his forehead. "Now we wait," she said, "and hope." "Thank you," Daniel said, and the emotion in his voice made Margaret uncomfortable. She wasn't used to gratitude anymore, wasn't sure she deserved it. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He's not out of danger." "But you let us in. That's more than I could hope for." Margaret moved to the window, putting distance between herself and the raw need in Daniel's expression. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down with relentless fury. Heat waves shimmered across the yard, and the grass looked brittle enough to snap. "This heat," she said, "it's the worst I've seen in 5 years, maybe longer." "I know," Daniel said. "I should have waited it out in the last town, but I thought if I could just push through." "Pride," Margaret said, "or desperation, or both." "Both," Daniel admitted. Silence settled between them, broken only by Samuel's labored breathing and the cicada's distant screaming. Margaret found herself studying Daniel's reflection in the window glass. The slump of his shoulders, the protective way he kept his eyes on his son, the defeated set of his jaw. "You can wash up," she said. "There's a basin by the back door. You'll find soap there, too." "I don't want to leave him." "I'm here," Margaret said. "I'll watch him." Daniel hesitated, then nodded slowly. He moved to the back of the cabin, and Margaret heard the sound of water being poured, the splash as he washed his face and hands. She returned to Samuel, checking his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead. Still too hot, but maybe not quite as bad. His breathing hadn't improved, though. That worried her. Fever was one thing, Lung trouble was another entirely. "How long have you been traveling?" she called to Daniel. 2 weeks, he said, his voice muffled by the towel she'd left hanging by the basin. "From Missouri." "Long way." "Not long enough to outrun some things." Margaret didn't ask what he was running from. People came to the plains for 2 reasons: opportunity or escape. She'd chosen the latter herself, in a way. Daniel returned looking marginally more human with the dust washed from his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 35, with strong features and eyes that probably smiled more when his life wasn't falling apart around him. "Sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the rocking chair. "You're about to fall over." "I should stay with Sam." "You can stay with him from the chair just as well as standing. Sit before you collapse and give me 2 patients instead of 1. He sat, and Margaret watched his body nearly melt into the chair with relief. His eyelids drooped immediately. "When did you last sleep?" she asked. "Really sleep? 3 nights ago, before Sam got sick." "You can't care for him if you're dead on your feet." "I can't sleep, not while he's like this." Margaret understood that too. She'd spent 72 hours awake during the worst of her family's illness, refusing to close her eyes for fear that death would take them while she wasn't watching. It hadn't mattered in the end. Death had taken them anyway. "I'll watch him," she heard herself say, "for an hour. You need to rest." "I couldn't ask." "You're not asking, I'm telling you. 1 hour. I'll wake you if anything changes." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw him weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, exhaustion won over fear. He nodded. "Just an hour," he said. "Just an hour," she agreed. He closed his eyes, and within minutes his breathing had deepened into sleep. Margaret watched the rise and fall of his chest, then turned her attention back to Samuel. The child looked so small, so fragile, wrapped in his blanket on her couch. His dark hair curled at his temples where sweat had dried. His small hands were curled loosely against his chest. Emma had looked like that, near the end, so small, so terribly, impossibly small. Margaret stood abruptly and moved to the kitchen, putting physical distance between herself and the memories. She needed to think practically, not emotionally. These strangers were here for 1 night. Daniel had said so himself. By tomorrow they'd be gone, and her life would return to its careful, controlled solitude. But even as she told herself this, she was pulling out bread and cheese, slicing both with practiced efficiency. She set out dried meat, a jar of preserves, a pitcher of water. Food for Daniel when he woke. Energy he'd need if he was going to continue his journey with the sick child. The practical part of her brain noted what supplies she was giving away, calculating how much remained, when she'd need to make her monthly trip to town. The emotional part, the part she'd tried so hard to bury, noticed how natural it felt to prepare food for someone else again, how her hands remembered the motions of caretaking even after 5 years. She checked on Samuel again. His color seemed slightly better, or maybe that was wishful thinking. She refreshed the cloth on his forehead with cool water and adjusted his blanket. As she did, his eyes flickered open, really open this time, focusing on her face. "Mama?" he whispered. The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. She froze, her hand still on his forehead, unable to breathe. "No, sweetheart," she managed finally, her voice rough. "I'm not your mama, but you're safe. Your papa is right there, sleeping." Samuel's eyes drifted to where Daniel slumped in the rocking chair, and some tension left his small body. "Papa." "That's right. He's very tired because he's been taking such good care of you." "Hot," Samuel whispered. "I know, baby. You have a fever, but we're going to make you better." "Thirsty." Finally, something concrete she could help with. Margaret quickly prepared a cup of water, adding just a tiny bit of honey to make it more appealing. She helped Samuel sit up enough to take small sips, careful not to let him drink too fast. "Slow," she coached gently. "Just little sips." He obeyed, his eyes never leaving her face. When he'd had enough, she laid him back down, and he surprised her by reaching for her hand. "Stay?" he asked. Margaret's throat tightened. "I'll stay," she whispered. Samuel's eyes closed again, but his tiny hand remained wrapped around her index finger. Margaret found herself trapped, physically and emotionally, unable to move without disturbing him. She settled onto the edge of the couch, her back already starting to protest the awkward position, and waited. Time slowed to the rhythm of Samuel's breathing. Through the window, she watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, its harsh white light mellowing to gold. The cicadas' screaming gradually decreased in volume. The day's worst heat was finally breaking. Daniel stirred in the rocking chair, shifting position but not waking. His face, in sleep, looked younger, less burdened. Margaret wondered what his story was, why he was traveling alone with a toddler, where Samuel's mother was. Then she stopped herself. Those questions led to connection, and connection led to caring, and caring led to loss. Better not to ask, better not to know. But Samuel's hand remained wrapped around her finger, a small anchor keeping her tethered to this moment, to these people who had blown into her life like dust on the wind. She thought about sending them away at first light, thought about holding firm to her solitude, protecting herself from any possibility of attachment or pain. She thought about these things, but she kept sitting there, her finger imprisoned by a fevered child's grip, and she didn't pull away. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret realized with a kind of resigned understanding that her carefully constructed isolation had just suffered its first real breach in 5 years. 2 strangers had knocked on her door asking for one night of shelter, and somehow, in the space of a few hours, they'd managed to reach past her defenses and touch something she thought she'd buried with her family. Outside, the evening breeze finally arrived, carrying slightly cooler air through the open windows. The curtains stirred, bringing relief from the oppressive heat. Samuel's breathing eased a little more. His grip on her finger loosened as he sank into deeper sleep. Margaret sat in the gathering dusk, a stranger's child holding her hand, a stranger sleeping in her rocking chair, and felt the first dangerous stirrings of something she'd sworn never to feel again. Hope that this time might be different, fear that it wouldn't be, and the terrible, awful, undeniable recognition that despite her best efforts, she was still capable of caring what happened to people who weren't her. The night would bring its own challenges, more fever, more fear, more moments of crisis. But in this quiet interlude between day and night, between heat and relief, between stranger and something more, Margaret Hale sat with a child's hand in hers and remembered what it felt like to be needed. She'd told herself for 5 years that she didn't want this, that she'd chosen solitude for good reason, that the safety of isolation outweighed the risk of connection. But maybe, she thought, as Samuel's breathing finally steadied into something closer to normal sleep, maybe she'd been lying to herself all along. The knock had come at her door in the middle of a brutal summer afternoon. 2 desperate strangers asking for one night's shelter. She'd said yes for the child's sake, for mercy's sake, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate even to herself. Now, as darkness slowly claimed the plains and the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, Margaret wondered if saying yes to one night had actually been saying yes to something much bigger, much more terrifying, much more impossibly hopeful than she could have imagined. The night stretched ahead, full of unknowns and possibilities. Samuel's fever would either break or worsen. Daniel would wake and they would navigate the strange intimacy of sharing space with strangers. Tomorrow would come with its own decisions and consequences. But for now, in this moment suspended between isolation and connection, Margaret simply sat and held a child's hand and let herself remember what it felt like to care. Daniel woke with a violent start, his body jerking forward in the rocking chair as if yanked by an invisible rope. His eyes flew open, wild and disoriented, searching the dimly lit room with the panic of a man who'd forgotten where he was. "Sam!" he gasped, already halfway out of the chair before his legs fully remembered how to support him. "He's right here," Margaret said quietly from the couch. "His fever broke about 20 minutes ago. He's sleeping naturally now." Daniel stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the couch. His hands hovered over Samuel's small form, as if afraid to touch him, to confirm he was real and breathing. Margaret understood that fear, the terror that hope might be another cruel trick, that relief might dissolve the moment you reached for it. "You can touch him," she said. "He's okay. For now." Daniel's hand finally settled on Samuel's forehead, and Margaret watched his entire body sag with relief. His head dropped forward, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion that he was clearly trying to contain. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking on both words. I thought, when I fell asleep, I didn't know if I'd wake up to. I know, Margaret said, because she did. She'd lived through those same terrifying calculations, that same desperate bargaining with fate. Daniel took several deep breaths, composing himself before looking up at her. The lamplight caught the wetness on his cheeks before he could wipe it away. I'm sorry, he said. I don't usually... It's been a difficult few days. You don't need to apologize for caring about your son, Margaret said. She stood, her back protesting after hours in the awkward position. There's food on the table. You should eat something. I couldn't take your food. You already are by being here. Might as well make it worthwhile. She moved toward the kitchen, putting distance between them before the emotion in the room could pull her in deeper. Besides, Samuel will need you strong when he wakes up properly. Can't care for him if you collapse from hunger. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to Samuel's forehead, so gentle, so full of relieved love that Margaret had to look away, before standing and following her to the kitchen table. The spread she'd laid out looked sparse in the lamplight, but Daniel's eyes widened as if she'd presented him with a feast. He sat down slowly, his movements careful, like a man who'd learned not to expect kindness and didn't quite trust it when it appeared. How long was I asleep? He asked, reaching for the bread. Almost 2 hours. I said 1, but you needed more. Margaret poured water into a cup and set it in front of him. You barely moved, dead to the world. I should have been watching him. Someone was watching him. Does it matter who? Daniel took a bite of bread and cheese, and Margaret saw the exact moment hunger overrode his pride. He ate quickly, but not frantically. A man remembering his manners even while starving. She sat across from him with her own cup of water, watching the darkness deepen outside the windows. The heat's finally breaking, she observed. You can feel the temperature dropping. Is it enough? For travel tomorrow, I mean? Margaret considered the question, weighing practicality against the uncomfortable truth that she wasn't sure she wanted him to leave yet. Samuel needed more recovery time. That was fact, not feeling. She could be honest about facts. No, she said. Even with the temperature dropping, it'll still be over 90 by mid-morning. Too hot to travel with a sick child on foot. Your horse is gone, you said. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. Had her for 7 years. Good mare. I pushed her too hard. That's on me. Survival decisions rarely feel like choices when you're making them, Margaret said. You did what you thought was necessary. Necessary. Daniel repeated the word like he was testing its weight. I've justified a lot under that banner lately. Margaret heard the story beneath his words. Guilt, regret, circumstances beyond his control forcing his hand. She'd lived that story herself, but asking for details meant opening doors she'd sworn to keep closed, so she redirected instead. How's the food? Best meal I've had in weeks, maybe months. He paused. His mother, Samuel's mother, she was a fine cook, made everything taste like more than it was, if you know what I mean. The past tense hung heavy in the air. Margaret knew she should let it drop, should keep the walls between them firm. But something about the way Daniel said it, the careful distance in his voice, the practiced steadiness, made her recognize a fellow survivor. Was? She asked quietly. Daniel's hand stilled on the bread. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, childbirth. Samuel's birth. She held him for maybe 10 minutes before... The midwife said it was blood loss. Said there was nothing anyone could have done. I don't know if that's true or if she was just being kind. I'm sorry, Margaret said and meant it. 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago, Daniel said. I count because Samuel counts. Every day he's alive is a day she's not here to see, and that feels like something that should be marked. Remembered. Margaret understood that impulse too. The need to measure loss in concrete terms, to give absence a shape and weight. She'd counted her own days after Thomas and the children died. At some point, around day 400 and something, she'd stopped. The numbers had started to feel less like memory and more like prison. And you've been raising him alone since then, she said. With help, at first. My wife's mother came to stay, but she died last winter. Her heart just gave out one morning. After that, it was just us. I tried to make it work in Missouri, but He trailed off, shaking his head. Too many memories. Too many people who looked at Sam and saw what he cost, who looked at me and saw a man who should have saved her somehow. So you ran. I prefer to call it starting over. Daniel took a long drink of water. My brother wrote saying there was work in Thomasville. Good land, a fresh start. It seemed like a sign. And now? Now I'm sitting in a stranger's kitchen, 3 days late, with no horse and a sick child, questioning every decision that led me here. He looked at her directly then, his gray eyes catching the lamplight. But at least Sam's alive. At least we made it this far. That counts for something. Margaret found herself nodding. Survival did count for something, even when it didn't feel like enough. Even when you spent 5 years alone wondering if mere existence could be considered living. A small sound from the couch made them both turn. Samuel was stirring, his head moving slightly against the pillow. Daniel was on his feet instantly, crossing the room with 2 long strides. Margaret followed more slowly, hanging back to give them space. "Hey there, little man," Daniel said softly, kneeling beside the couch. "How are you feeling?" Samuel's eyes opened, clearer now than they'd been hours ago. "Papa?" "Right here, Sam. I'm right here." "Where are we?" "We're in a nice lady's house. She helped you when you were sick. Can you say thank you to Miss Margaret?" Samuel's eyes found Margaret standing near the kitchen. He studied her with the solemn intensity that small children could manage, then offered a shy smile. "Thank you, Miss Margaret." The butchered pronunciation of her name struck something in Margaret's chest that she wasn't prepared for. She'd thought those feelings were dead, cauterized by grief and time. Apparently she'd been wrong. "You're welcome, Samuel," she managed. "Are you hungry, Sam?" Daniel asked. "Think you could eat something?" Samuel nodded, and Daniel looked to Margaret with a question in his eyes. She moved to the kitchen and prepared a small plate. Bread torn into pieces a child could handle, a bit of cheese, some preserved peaches from last summer's canning. She brought it over and watched as Samuel sat up slowly, accepting the food with both hands. He ate carefully, small bites chewed thoroughly, and Margaret could see Daniel watching for any signs of nausea or distress. But the food stayed down, and some color returned to Samuel's cheeks. After several minutes, the child's eyes started to droop again. "Sleepy?" Daniel asked. "Mm-hmm." "That's okay. Sleep is good. Sleep helps you get better." Daniel helped Samuel lie back down, tucking the blanket around him with practiced ease. "I'll be right here if you need me." "Where's here?" Samuel asked, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. "A safe place," Daniel said. "Don't worry about it. Just rest." Samuel's eyes closed, and within moments, his breathing had evened out into sleep. Daniel remained kneeling beside him, one hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. "He should stay down now," Margaret said quietly. "The fever breaking and him eating, those are good signs, but he'll need at least another full day of rest before he's strong enough for travel." Daniel looked up at her, conflict clear on his face. "I've already imposed on your hospitality far more than I intended. You asked for 1 night. I'm suggesting 2. There's a difference." "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference there, too." Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. "That heat isn't going anywhere tomorrow. Maybe by the next day it'll break properly, but tomorrow, it'll be brutal again. You want to risk Samuel having a relapse?" She could feel Daniel's internal struggle without looking at him. Pride versus practicality, independence versus his son's welfare. She knew which would win because she understood the weight of a child's life in a parent's hands. 2 days, Daniel said finally. "But I'll work. I saw your fence line on the way in. It needs repair, and your chicken coop could use some reinforcement. I can do that. I'm handy with tools." "You don't need to "Yes, I do," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. "I won't be a charity case. If we're staying, I work. That's the condition." Margaret recognized the pride in his stance, the need to maintain dignity even while accepting help. She'd felt the same way when neighbors tried to assist her after Thomas died. Some needs were about more than physical survival. "Fine," she said. "The fence it is. But not tomorrow. Tomorrow you rest too. Get your strength back." "I'm fine." "You collapsed in my doorway 6 hours ago. You're not fine. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's face, the first she'd seen from him. You're a hard woman, Miss Hale. Margaret, if you're staying 2 days, we can skip the formalities. And I'm not hard. I'm practical. There's a difference. You seem fond of pointing out differences. I'm fond of clarity. Prevents misunderstandings. Daniel stood, stretching muscles that had to be aching after his long walk. Clarity. I can work with that. He glanced around the cabin as if seeing it properly for the first time. You live here alone? I do. For how long? Margaret considered not answering, but the question was fair enough given that she was sheltering him. 5 years? That's a long time to be isolated. I prefer isolated to vulnerable. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw Daniel process them, reading between the lines. He was smart enough not to push further. Where should I sleep? He asked instead. I don't want to impose on your bed. There's a cot in the storage room. I'll help you set it up. Margaret led him to a small room off the kitchen where she kept supplies and tools. The cot was folded against the wall, and together they pulled it out and set it up near Samuel's couch, close enough for Daniel to hear if his son needed him in the night. Blanket? Daniel asked. It's too hot for blankets. The windows will stay open. We'll get a cross breeze. As if to prove her point, a slight wind stirred through the cabin, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and distant dust. The cicadas had gone quiet, their daytime screaming replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional call of a night bird. Margaret found herself acutely aware of the strangeness of the situation. 2 days ago, she'd been alone as always, following her routines, protected by her solitude. Now she had 2 strangers sleeping in her home, and she'd just agreed to extend their stay. The Margaret of 5 years ago would have found this natural. The Margaret of yesterday would have found it impossible. Who was she now, in this moment between those 2 versions of herself? I should let you sleep, Daniel said, misreading her silence as discomfort. It's been a long day for everyone. My bedroom is through there, Margaret said, pointing to the door on the far side of the cabin. I'm a light sleeper. If you need anything in the night, if Samuel takes a turn, knock on my door. I will. Thank you, Margaret, for everything. She nodded and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door but not latching it. She changed into her nightgown and lay down on her bed, listening to the sounds of Daniel settling onto the cot, the creak of its frame, the rustle of fabric as he adjusted his position. Sleep should have come easily after the emotional exhaustion of the day, but Margaret found herself staring at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet. She thought about Samuel's small hand wrapped around her finger. She thought about Daniel's tears when he'd seen his son was improving. She thought about the way the cabin had felt different tonight, less empty, less silent, less like a monument to the past and more like a place where living happened. It scared her, that feeling. It scared her how easily she'd slipped back into caretaking, how natural it had felt to prepare food for someone else, to monitor a fevered child, to make decisions based on others' needs rather than her own carefully constructed isolation. This was temporary, she reminded herself. 2 days, maybe 3 at most. Then Daniel and Samuel would move on to Thomasville, to Daniel's brother, to whatever life was waiting for them there. Her cabin would return to its accustomed silence, and she would return to her routines. This was just a brief interruption, not a permanent change. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The walls she'd built so carefully around her heart had developed a crack, and she wasn't sure she could repair it before more damage was done. Morning came with surprising gentleness. The heat hadn't broken completely, but the air had a different quality, less oppressive, more breathable. Margaret woke before dawn as always, her internal clock precise after years of the same schedule. She dressed quietly and emerged from her bedroom to find Daniel already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot watching Samuel sleep. He looked up when she entered, putting a finger to his lips. Fever hasn't come back, he whispered. I checked an hour ago. He's cool to the touch. Margaret nodded and moved to the kitchen to start her morning routine. Coffee first. Real coffee that she rationed carefully, allowing herself 1 cup each day. The ritual of grinding the beans, heating the water, waiting for it to brew provided a centering she needed this morning. Daniel joined her in the kitchen after a few minutes, moving quietly to avoid waking Samuel. Can I help? He asked. Can you cook? Basic things, nothing fancy. Eggs and bacon aren't fancy. Think you can handle that while I check on the chickens? I can manage. Margaret showed him where she kept the food and the cookware, then stepped outside into the early morning air. The sun was just touching the horizon, painting everything in shades of pink and gold. Her 6 hens greeted her with their usual fussing, and she collected 5 eggs from the nesting boxes. When she returned inside, the smell of cooking bacon filled the cabin. Daniel stood at her stove, managing 2 pans with competent efficiency. Samuel was stirring on the couch, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Sam," Daniel called over. "How do you feel?" "Better," Samuel said, his voice stronger than yesterday. "Can I have bacon?" "That's a good sign," Margaret said, setting the eggs on the counter. Sick children don't ask for bacon. Sick children also don't usually have bacon offered, Daniel said. It's a luxury we haven't had in weeks. Everything's a luxury when you're traveling light, Margaret observed. They ate together at the small kitchen table, the first time Margaret had shared a meal with anyone in 5 years. Samuel sat on Daniel's lap, managing to get more food on his face than in his mouth, requiring frequent wiping with a napkin. The domesticity of the scene struck Margaret with unexpected force. This was what she'd given up when she'd chosen isolation, not just the presence of people, but the small rituals that made up daily life, shared meals, casual conversation, the comfortable silence of people existing together without needing to fill every moment with words. "What's your usual routine?" Daniel asked as they cleaned up. "I don't want to disrupt your day more than necessary." "Morning chores, mostly. Garden watering, chicken feeding, general maintenance. Afternoons I do mending or other inside work. Evenings I read." "Simple." "Sustainable," Margaret corrected. "Everything I do serves a purpose. Nothing wasted." "That's one way to live." "It's the way that works for me." Daniel didn't argue, just nodded as he dried the dishes she washed. They fell into an easy rhythm, her washing, him drying, Samuel playing quietly on the floor with a wooden spoon he'd claimed as a toy. "I know you said I should rest today," Daniel said after a while, "but I'm not good at sitting idle. If I could at least look at that fence, make a plan for repairs tomorrow." Margaret almost refused on principle, then stopped herself. She understood the need to feel useful, to do something productive rather than drowning in gratitude and obligation. She'd felt the same way during the worst of her grief. Work had been salvation, a way to exhaust herself enough to sleep without dreaming. "Look, but don't repair," she said. "If you overdo it today, you won't be useful tomorrow." "Fair enough." They spent the morning in a strange kind of dance, together but separate, sharing space while maintaining distance. Daniel inspected the fence line while Margaret tended her garden. Samuel stayed in the shade near the cabin, his energy clearly not back to normal despite his improved appetite. Margaret found herself watching them when she thought they weren't looking. The way Daniel would check on Samuel every few minutes, making sure he had water, that he wasn't too hot. The way Samuel's eyes followed his father's movements, that constant need for reassurance that the important person hadn't disappeared. She recognized that dynamic. James and Emma had been the same way when they were small, needing to know where their parents were, finding security in proximity. It was how children were supposed to be, how parents were supposed to respond. Normal family dynamics that had once been her entire world. Around midday, the heat intensified again despite the previous night's cooling. Margaret called them both inside, closing windows and drawing curtains to keep out the worst of it. They settled into the relative coolness of the cabin, and Daniel produced a worn book from his pack, a collection of folk tales. "Sam's favorite," he explained, settling on the couch with his son. "We read a story every afternoon when it's too hot to do anything else." "I can go to my room," Margaret offered. "Give you privacy." "You don't have to," Daniel said, "unless we're bothering you." Margaret found herself sitting in the rocking chair with her mending basket, listening as Daniel read aloud. His voice was good for storytelling, warm and expressive, changing slightly for different characters. Samuel leaned against his father's chest, thumb in mouth, eyes half closed in contentment. The scene was almost painfully normal, almost painfully what Margaret's life used to be, what she'd convinced herself she'd never want again. But sitting there, listening to Daniel read about clever foxes and brave children, watching Samuel's peaceful face, feeling the afternoon heat press against the cabin walls while coolness remained inside. Margaret felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Not quite hope. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of hope. The acknowledgement that life could contain moments like this again, that shelter could be more than just protection from the elements. The story ended, and Samuel's eyes were fully closed, his breathing even. Daniel carefully set the book aside and adjusted his son's position so they could both rest more comfortably. "Thank you," he said quietly to Margaret, "for letting us stay, for not making us leave." "Where would you go?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice practical even as her heart resisted the coldness. "You need rest. Samuel needs recovery time. It's just logic." "It's kindness," Daniel corrected gently. "You can call it logic if that makes it easier, but we both know what it really is." Margaret didn't respond, just returned her attention to her mending. But she felt his words settle somewhere deep, in a place she'd thought was sealed off permanently. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Daniel dozed with Samuel on the couch. Margaret worked through her mending basket, then moved on to other tasks, checking supplies, making notes of what she'd need on her next town trip, planning meals for the next few days, planning for guests. When had she started doing that? As evening approached and the heat finally began to ease again, Samuel woke more refreshed. His color was good, his energy better. He asked to go outside, and Daniel carried him to the porch where they could sit in the shade and watch the sunset begin. Margaret joined them after a few minutes, bringing water for all three of them. They sat together, Daniel on the porch step with Samuel on his lap, Margaret in the old rocking chair she kept outside, and watched the sky turn colors as the sun descended. "It's beautiful out here," Daniel said. "Harsh, but beautiful." "Beauty and harshness aren't mutually exclusive," Margaret observed. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Spoken like someone who's learned to appreciate both. Spoken like someone who's learned to survive both. Samuel pointed at something in the distance, probably a hawk circling over the grassland, and Daniel explained what the child was seeing, his voice patient and warm. Margaret found herself studying their profiles against the sunset, father and son outlined in golden light, and something in her chest ached with a mixture of loss and longing she couldn't quite name. This was temporary, she reminded herself again. A brief intersection of lives that would diverge again soon. She couldn't afford to forget that. Couldn't afford to start imagining that this feeling, this sense of not being alone, could be permanent. But as darkness fell and they moved back inside, as Margaret prepared a simple dinner and Daniel set the table while Samuel played at their feet, she felt the walls around her heart developing new cracks with each passing hour. 2 strangers had knocked on her door asking for one night. She'd given them 2 days. And somewhere in the space between isolation and connection, between safety and risk, between the life she'd chosen and the life that was unfolding. Whether she'd chosen it or not, Margaret Hale was discovering that the heart doesn't always follow the rules you set for it. The cabin that had been silent for 5 years now held voices, laughter, the sound of a child asking questions, and a father patiently answering. It held life in a way that made Margaret remember what she'd lost, but also, terrifyingly, what she might still be capable of having, if she was brave enough to reach for it, if she was strong enough to risk loss again, if she could convince herself that some things were worth the danger of caring. The second night passed more peacefully than the first, though Margaret slept fitfully, her mind refusing to settle. She woke several times to silence broken only by the sounds of Daniel's steady breathing from the main room and the occasional rustle as Samuel shifted in his sleep. Each time, she lay in the darkness wondering what she was doing, why she'd extended their stay, what dangerous territory she was navigating by allowing these strangers to remain. But morning came regardless of her doubts, bringing with it a heat that felt different from the previous days, thick and heavy, pressing down like a hand on the chest. Margaret recognized the quality of the air immediately. Storm weather. The pressure was building toward something, though whether it would break in rain or simply churn itself out in dry thunder remained to be seen. She found Daniel already awake again, this time examining the fence posts he'd brought in from outside. He looked up when she emerged from her bedroom, and she saw he'd noticed the weather change too. "Feels like a storm," he said quietly. "Might be. Might just be pressure with no payoff. The plains are unpredictable that way." Margaret moved to start the coffee, her hands going through the familiar motions while her mind worked through the implications. If it does storm, you can't travel. I know. Daniel set down the fence post and straightened. Samuel's much better, but you're right. He needs another day at least. I was thinking, if the weather holds, we could leave early tomorrow morning, get a few hours of travel in before the heat builds. Something in Margaret's chest twisted at the word leave, which irritated her. She'd known from the beginning they would go, had told herself repeatedly this was temporary, had built her entire mental framework around the certainty of their departure. So why did the word feel like a stone dropping into still water? That's sensible, she said, keeping her voice neutral. Samuel should be strong enough by then. Margaret, Daniel's voice made her turn to face him. His gray eyes were serious, searching her face for something she wasn't sure she wanted him to find. I want you to know, these 2 days, they've meant more than just shelter. Samuel and I, we've been running for so long, and this is the first place that's felt like we could stop, even briefly. You gave us that. That's not a small thing. I gave you a roof and some meals. That's basic hospitality, not a miracle. Maybe, but you gave them when you didn't have to, when it clearly cost you something to open your door. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. You've been alone a long time. I recognize that kind of isolation because I felt it too, even surrounded by people. It's the loneliness of loss, of deciding that nothing hurts if you don't let anything in. Margaret's hand stilled on the coffee pot. You don't know anything about me. I know you lost people you loved. I know you chose this place, this distance, as protection. I know that letting us stay has been harder than you've admitted. Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. I also know you're a good person who saw a child in need and couldn't turn away, even though every instinct probably told you to. Don't make me into something noble, Margaret said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. I acted on impulse, not virtue. Sometimes they're the same thing. Before Margaret could respond, Samuel's voice called out from the couch. Papa, I'm hungry. The moment broke, and both adults moved to tend to the child. But Daniel's words hung in the air between them, uncomfortable truths that Margaret couldn't quite dismiss. She busied herself with breakfast preparations while Daniel helped Samuel wash up, grateful for the distraction of routine tasks. They ate together again, and Margaret found herself memorizing small details against her will. The way Samuel hummed while he chewed, how Daniel cut his son's food into perfect bite-sized pieces, the comfortable silence that had developed between the three of them that didn't require constant conversation to fill space. After breakfast, Daniel insisted on starting the fence repairs despite the threatening weather. If I'm leaving tomorrow, I want to finish what I promised, he said, and Margaret recognized the stubbornness in his tone. It matched her own. Fine, but work in stages. Don't exhaust yourself in this heat. Yes, ma'am, he said with a slight smile that made him look younger, less burdened. Margaret kept Samuel inside with her, and the child proved surprisingly good company. He was quiet but curious, watching as she worked through her morning tasks and asking simple questions that she found herself answering with more patience than she'd expected. Why don't you got any kids? Samuel asked at one point, his child's directness cutting through adult pretense. Margaret's hands froze on the bread dough she was kneading. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the sudden surge of grief that his innocent question had triggered. I did, she heard herself say, a long time ago. Where are they? They died, sweetheart. They got sick and died. Samuel processed this with the strange acceptance children sometimes showed toward death, acknowledging it as fact without fully grasping its permanence. That's sad. Yes, it is. My mama died too. Papa says she's watching from heaven, but I don't remember her. He looked up at Margaret with those solemn eyes. Do you remember your kids? Every day, Margaret whispered. Does it hurt? The question, so simple and direct, demanded an honest answer. Yes, but not as much as it used to. The hurt becomes different, quieter, but it never completely goes away. Samuel nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Papa cries sometimes at night. He thinks I'm asleep, but I hear him. I think he has the quiet hurt too. Margaret's heart constricted. She looked out the window to where Daniel was working on the fence. his movements efficient despite the oppressive heat, and she saw him differently now. Not just as a stranger seeking shelter, but as a fellow survivor carrying wounds that matched her own. "Your papa loves you very much," she said to Samuel. "I know, that's why he's so tired. Love makes you tired sometimes." The wisdom in those childish words struck Margaret with unexpected force. Love did make you tired. Caring for someone, worrying about them, putting their needs before your own, it was exhausting in ways that physical labor never could be. She'd forgotten that. Or maybe she'd deliberately put it out of her mind along with all the other things that came with connection. Around midday, the sky darkened to a bruised purple gray. The air grew heavier still, and the birds went silent, always a bad sign. Margaret called Daniel inside just as the first rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. "Storm's coming," she said unnecessarily. Daniel nodded, latching the door behind him. "I got 3 posts replaced and reinforced the corner section. It's not everything, but it's the worst of what needed doing." "You didn't have to. I wanted to. It felt good to work with my hands on something that mattered." They stood at the window together, watching the storm build. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the thunder grew louder. Samuel pressed against Daniel's leg, not quite frightened, but wanting reassurance. "It's okay, Sam," Daniel said softly. "Just a storm. We're safe inside." The wind picked up suddenly, bending the grass in waves and rattling the windows. Margaret moved through the cabin, closing shutters and securing anything that might blow. Daniel helped without being asked, anticipating what needed doing. When the rain finally came, it arrived with shocking violence. One moment the air was dry and waiting, the next it was filled with water falling so hard it sounded like stones hitting the roof. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes, and the relief was almost dizzying. "When was your last real rain?" Daniel asked, having to raise his voice over the downpour. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. Margaret found herself smiling despite the storm's ferocity. The garden needed this desperately. Everything needed this. They watched the rain together, and Margaret felt something shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the weather. The storm had trapped them inside, forced a proximity that went beyond mere sharing of space. In the darkened cabin with rain drumming overhead, the 3 of them became a unit, separate individuals sheltering together against nature's fury. Samuel climbed onto the couch and patted the spot next to him. "Miss Margaret, come sit. Papa, you too. We can tell stories till the rain stops." Daniel looked at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She should refuse. Should maintain the distance that would make their leaving easier tomorrow. Should protect herself against this growing sense of belonging that felt more dangerous than any storm. Instead, she found herself settling onto the couch beside Samuel. Daniel sat on the child's other side, and Samuel leaned against Margaret with unselfconscious trust that made her throat tight. "What kind of story?" Daniel asked. "A scary one, but not too scary. I think I can manage that." Daniel began spinning a tale about a clever rabbit who outwitted a fox through a series of increasingly improbable schemes. Samuel giggled at the silly parts and pressed closer during the suspenseful moments. Margaret found herself drawn in despite knowing it was a children's story, despite telling herself she should resist this intimacy. When Daniel finished, Samuel immediately demanded another. "Miss Margaret's turn." Margaret hesitated, her mind going blank. She hadn't told a story in 5 years. Hadn't read aloud or played pretend or done any of the 1,000 small things that made up a parent's daily life. She'd locked all of that away along with her grief. "I don't know any stories," she started to say, but Samuel's disappointed face stopped her. She found herself reaching back into memory, pulling up a tale her own mother used to tell her about a girl who could talk to the wind. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse, but as she continued, they began to flow more smoothly. Samuel listened with rapt attention, and when she glanced at Daniel, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. The storm raged outside while inside the cabin grew warm with shared stories and quiet laughter. They took turns. Daniel, then Samuel with his meandering, illogical narratives that only made sense to him, then Margaret again. The afternoon passed in this strange suspension of time, rain continuing its percussion overhead. Eventually, Samuel's eyes began to droop. The storm's intensity had lessened to a steady rain, and the child's full belly and the cozy atmosphere proved too much for his young body to resist. He fell asleep with his head in Margaret's lap, one small hand clutching the fabric of her skirt. Daniel reached over carefully and adjusted the blanket over his son. "I should move him." "He's fine where he is," Margaret heard herself say. "Let him sleep." So they sat there, Margaret and Daniel on opposite ends of the couch with the sleeping child between them, listening to the rain gradually diminish from downpour to shower to drizzle. The silence between them felt different now. Not the careful distance of strangers, but something more complicated. "Margaret," Daniel said finally, his voice low so as not to wake Samuel. "Can I ask you something?" She tensed, knowing whatever he was about to ask would require a truth she might not want to give. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his words. "When we leave tomorrow, would you want us to stay in touch? Samuel's taken to you, and you've been good with him. Good for him. I thought maybe we could write once we're settled in Thomasville." Every instinct screamed at Margaret to refuse. Letters meant ongoing connection. Connection meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant risk. She'd spent 5 years building walls specifically to avoid this kind of entanglement, but Samuel's hand was still clutching her skirt, and she could feel the warmth of his small body against hers, and she remembered what it felt like to matter to someone again. "I don't know," she said honestly. I haven't let anyone close in a long time." "I know. I'm not asking for close, just occasional correspondence, letting you know we made it safely. Maybe a letter at Christmas." "Why?" The question came out more sharply than she'd intended. "Why would you want to maintain contact with a stranger who gave you shelter for a few days?" "Because you're not a stranger anymore," Daniel said simply. "Because Samuel will ask about you, and I want to be able to tell him you're doing well. Because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because I think you've been alone long enough, and maybe having some connection to the world, even just letters, might be good for you." "You don't know what's good for me." "No. But I recognize someone fighting the same battle I've been fighting. The question of whether surviving means just existing or actually living." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm choosing to live, Margaret. For Samuel's sake, yes, but also for my own. I think maybe you could make that choice too." Before Margaret could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Samuel stirred but didn't wake. Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances. Who would be out in this weather? Who even knew to come here? Margaret carefully extracted herself from beneath Samuel and moved to the door. Through the window, she could see 2 figures on her porch, men, both wearing hats pulled low against the rain. She didn't recognize them, which meant they weren't neighbors. "Stay with Samuel," she said quietly to Daniel. Something in her tone made him nod without argument. Margaret opened the door just wide enough to see out, but not wide enough to invite entry. The 2 men were strangers, rough-looking, with mud-splattered clothes and calculating eyes that swept over her and tried to see past her into the cabin. "Help you, gentlemen?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Sorry to disturb, ma'am," the taller one said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "We're traveling through, got caught in the storm. Saw your cabin and thought maybe you could spare some water, maybe a bit of food if you have it." Margaret's instincts prickled. Something about these men felt wrong, not the desperation of travelers genuinely in need, but something more predatory. The way their eyes kept moving, cataloging, assessing. "I can bring out water," she said, "but I'll need you to wait here." "Seems inhospitable to make us stand in the rain," the second man said. He was shorter but broader, with a scar across his left cheek. "Just asking for common courtesy. And I'm offering what I can offer. Water, take it or leave it." The tall one's expression hardened. "We saw tracks leading here. Fresh ones. Man and child by the look of them. You alone out here?" Every nerve in Margaret's body went on alert. These weren't travelers seeking help. These were men with purpose, men looking for something or someone specific. "I don't see how my household is your concern," she said evenly. "Now, do you want the water or not?" Before they could answer, Daniel appeared beside her in the doorway. His presence was unexpected and clearly not what the 2 men had anticipated. He held himself differently now, taller, more solid, with an edge that hadn't been visible before. The lady said she'd bring water, Daniel said, his voice carrying an unmistakable warning. That's generous given the circumstances. I suggest you accept her offer and move along. The two men exchanged glances. The shorter one's hand moved toward his belt, and Margaret saw the handle of a knife there. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. We don't want trouble, the tall one said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just thought neighbors might help each other out. We're not neighbors, Margaret said firmly, and you're not travelers in distress. You're looking for something. Best you look elsewhere. For a long moment, the five of them stood frozen. Margaret and Daniel in the doorway, the two strangers on the porch, rain continuing its steady fall. The tension stretched tight as wire. Then a voice called out from the darkness beyond the porch, making everyone turn. There you are. A third man emerged from the gloom, leading two horses. Found them grazing by the creek. Come on, we've wasted enough time here. The tall stranger held Margaret's gaze for another heartbeat, then nodded slowly. Appreciate your hospitality, ma'am. We'll be on our way. They left, mounting their horses and disappearing into the rainy darkness. But Margaret and Daniel remained in the doorway, watching until they were certain the men were truly gone. That wasn't about water, Daniel said quietly, closing and latching the door. No, it wasn't. Margaret moved to check the windows, making sure the shutters were secure. They were looking for you. Maybe. Or maybe they were just opportunists who saw a lone cabin and thought it was an easy target. You don't believe that any more than I do. Margaret turned to face him. Who's looking for you, Daniel? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion and worry etched into his features. I don't know for certain. Could be my wife's family. They never accepted that she died in childbirth. Some of them blamed me, said I should have gotten her to a doctor sooner, spent money we didn't have on better care. After her mother died and I decided to leave Missouri, my brother-in-law made some threats. Said Samuel belonged with blood family, not with the man who killed their daughter. That's insane. Childbirth complications? Grief isn't rational, Daniel interrupted. I know that, you know that, but people need someone to blame, and I was convenient. He moved to the couch where Samuel still slept peacefully, unaware of the danger that had just passed by. I thought putting distance between us would end it, but maybe they're more determined than I realized. Margaret felt her protective instincts surge, not just for Samuel now, but for Daniel too. These were her people in this moment, under her roof, and no one had the right to threaten them here. They won't come back tonight, she said with certainty. The rain is good cover for us now. They won't want to search in this weather. But tomorrow we'll deal with tomorrow. Margaret surprised herself with the vehemence in her voice. Right now we're safe. Samuel is safe. That's what matters. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. You're a fierce woman, Margaret Hale. I'm a practical woman, and practically speaking, those men were testing boundaries. If we show weakness, they'll exploit it. But if we stand firm, she trailed off, thinking through scenarios. How long until your brother expects you in Thomasville? He knew I was aiming for last week sometime. I'm already late enough that he'll be worried. Can you send word? Let him know you're delayed but safe? There's a telegraph office in town, about 8 miles south, but nothing. Tomorrow, storm or not, you take one of my horses and ride to town. Send your wire. Get supplies if we need them. I'll stay here with Samuel. I can't leave you here alone with him, not with those men out there. Why not? I'm capable of protecting one child for a few hours. Margaret's voice took on an edge. Or do you think because I'm a woman? That's not what I meant, Daniel interrupted. I've seen how capable you are. I just meant, if they come back, if they try something, I have a rifle. I know how to use it, and I'm not afraid to protect what's mine. The last words hung in the air between them, and Margaret realized what she'd said. What's mine? As if Samuel and Daniel had become her responsibility, her people, her family in some way. She saw Daniel recognize it too, saw his expression soften with understanding. Okay, he said quietly. Tomorrow I'll ride to town. Send the wire. Buy some supplies. Be back by early afternoon. Good. They settled into an uneasy routine for the rest of the evening. The rain continued, lighter now, but steady. Margaret prepared dinner while Daniel kept watch at the windows, his body tense with vigilance. Samuel woke and ate, blessedly oblivious to the danger that had brushed so close. Night fell dark and absolute. Margaret lit lamps, but kept them low. Bright windows would advertise their presence to anyone watching. She made up Daniel's cot near the door, where he could hear anyone approaching, and settled Samuel on the couch with extra blankets. Sleep with one ear open, she told Daniel as they prepared for bed. Always do when Sam's with me. Margaret retreated to her bedroom but left the door ajar. She lay in the darkness, listening to the rain on the roof and the house settling around her. Her rifle leaned against the wall beside her bed, loaded and ready. She'd never fired it at a person, only at coyotes and rattlesnakes. But tonight, she knew she would if necessary. The cabin that had been a sanctuary of isolation for 5 years had become a fortress. And Margaret, who'd chosen solitude to avoid loss, found herself willing to fight to protect the temporary family that had arrived on her doorstep. Something had changed in her during these few days. The walls she'd built were crumbling faster than she could repair them. She cared about the child sleeping in her main room. She cared about the man keeping watch at her door. She cared whether they lived or died, succeeded or failed, found safety or danger. The realization terrified her more than the threat of strangers in the night ever could, because caring meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant pain, and pain was what she'd spent 5 years running from. But as she drifted toward uneasy sleep, Margaret understood that some choices weren't really choices at all. The heart didn't ask permission before attaching itself to people. It simply did, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the risk. Samuel had called her Miss McGree in his innocent way, had held her hand, had fallen asleep in her lap. Daniel had looked at her with understanding and trust, had shared his story, had stood beside her against danger. They'd cracked her defenses not through force, but through simple presence, through being human and needing and letting her matter to them. Tomorrow Daniel would ride to town. Tomorrow they would reassess the danger and make new plans. Tomorrow she might convince herself to send them away, to return to her chosen isolation, to rebuild her walls before they crumbled completely. But tonight, in the darkness with rain falling and strangers lurking somewhere in the night, Margaret Hale stood guard over two people who'd become something more than strangers, and she discovered that the fiercest protection comes not from walls or weapons, but from the simple, terrifying decision to care whether someone else lives or dies. The storm had broken the heat, but it had also broken something in Margaret, some essential barrier between past and present, between isolation and connection, between surviving and living. And despite her fear, despite every warning instinct, some part of her recognized that this breaking might be exactly what she needed, even if it killed her, even if it saved her. Either way, there was no going back now. Dawn came slowly, the sky shifting from black to gray as rain continued its steady whisper against the roof. Margaret woke before first light as always, but this time the sound of movement in the main room told her Daniel had beaten her to consciousness. She dressed quickly and emerged to find him already checking the windows, his body taut with watchfulness. "Anything?" she asked quietly. "Nothing. If they're out there, they're staying hidden." He turned from the window, and Margaret could see the exhaustion etched into his face. "I don't think I slept more than an hour." "Neither did I." They stood in the pre-dawn dimness, two people united by vigilance and fear. Samuel remained asleep on the couch, his breathing peaceful and even, blissfully ignorant of the danger his presence had brought to this place. "I should go soon," Daniel said. "Get to town early, send the wire, be back before afternoon. Take the chestnut mare. She's steady and won't spook easily." Margaret moved to the kitchen and began preparing coffee. "I'll pack you some food for the ride." They worked in comfortable silence, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over the past days. Margaret made bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, while Daniel checked the saddlebags and made sure the rifle she insisted he take was properly loaded. "You sure about this?" he asked as the sky outside lightened to pearl gray. "Leaving you here with Sam?" "I'm sure about you needing to send that wire. Your brother needs to know you're delayed, and we need him to know where you are, in case—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood. In case something happened, in case the men came back, in case Daniel didn't return. Margaret. Daniel crossed the room to stand before her, his gray eyes serious. If those men come back while I'm gone, I'll handle it. I'm not questioning your capability. I'm saying don't take unnecessary risks. If they're determined, if they push too hard, you take Samuel and run. There's a root cellar? Behind the cabin, doors hidden under the chicken coop. Show me before I leave. They stepped outside into the damp morning air. The rain had stopped finally, leaving everything washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Margaret led Daniel around back and showed him the concealed entrance to the cellar, a space she'd never actually used, but that Thomas had insisted on building years ago. It's small but secure, she said. If I need to, I can get Samuel down there and no one would know to look. Daniel nodded, memorizing the location. Then he surprised her by taking her hand, his grip warm and firm. Thank you. For everything. For taking us in, for protecting Sam, for... He struggled for words. For being someone I can trust with the most important thing in my life. Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to pull away, to maintain the distance that would make their inevitable parting easier. But his hand in hers felt like an anchor, solid and real, and she found herself holding on. Just get back safely, she said. That's all the thanks I need. He squeezed her hand once more, then released it. They returned to the cabin where Samuel was just beginning to stir. Daniel knelt beside the couch and smoothed his son's dark hair back from his forehead. Hey there, Sam. Papa has to go into town for a few hours. You're going to stay here with Miss Margaret. Can you be good for her? Samuel rubbed his eyes, processing this information. You're coming back? Of course I'm coming back. Before you know it, I'll be here again. Daniel kissed his son's forehead. I promise. Okay. Samuel seemed satisfied with this assurance. He turned to Margaret. Can we make cookies? The request was so innocent, so utterly normal in the midst of their fear and uncertainty that Margaret felt something crack in her chest. Yes, we can make cookies. Daniel stood and gathered his things, the saddlebags with food and water, the rifle, a coat in case the rain returned. At the door he paused and looked back at them, Margaret and Samuel sitting together on the couch, and something passed across his face that Margaret couldn't quite read. Longing, maybe. Or hope. Or fear of losing what he'd only just found. Be safe, Margaret said. You too, both of you. Then he was gone, and Margaret heard the sound of the mare's hooves moving away into the morning. She went to the window and watched until Daniel disappeared over the first rise, becoming a dark shape against the gray sky before vanishing entirely. Samuel climbed down from the couch and came to stand beside her. Papa will be okay. Your papa is very capable. He'll be just fine. Margaret said it with more confidence than she felt. Now, about those cookies. You think you can help me measure flour? Samuel's face brightened, and they moved to the kitchen. Margaret found herself grateful for the distraction of baking, for the simple rhythm of measuring and mixing that kept her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into worry. Samuel proved to be an enthusiastic, if messy, helper, getting more flour on himself than in the bowl. Mama used to make cookies, he said suddenly, his small hands working the dough with serious concentration. Papa told me, but I don't remember. What else did your papa tell you about your mama? That she was pretty, that she sang songs, that she loved me very much but had to go away. Samuel looked up at Margaret with those solemn eyes. Did your kids like cookies? The question hit like a fist to the stomach, but Margaret forced herself to breathe through it. Yes, they did. Emma especially, she had a terrible sweet tooth. James preferred savory things, but he'd eat cookies if his sister was having them. What happened to them? Margaret's hand stilled in the dough. She'd avoided talking about her children for 5 years, had locked those memories away so thoroughly that speaking them aloud felt like breaking a seal. But Samuel's question was innocent, without guile, and she found she couldn't deflect it. They got sick. A fever, like you had, but worse. Much worse. The doctor came, but there wasn't anything he could do. My husband Thomas got sick too. Her voice remained steady, though her heart was racing. They all died within a week of each other. Emma first, then James, then Thomas. That's sad. Yes, very sad. You were all alone after? Yes. Samuel seemed to think about this for a moment, then reached over and patted her hand with his flower-covered fingers. The gesture was so tender, so completely without self-consciousness, that tears sprang to Margaret's eyes before she could stop them. You're not alone now, Samuel said matter-of-factly. Papa and me are here. Margaret had to turn away, pretending to need something from the cupboard while she composed herself. When had she become someone who cried? She'd spent 5 years with eyes as dry as the summer plains, refusing to let grief have that power over her. Now a child's simple kindness had undone her completely. Thank you, Samuel, she managed. That's very kind of you to say. They finished the cookies and set them to bake, filling the cabin with the warm smell of butter and sugar. Samuel chattered about things that mattered to him. A dog he'd once seen, how tall grass looked like water, whether clouds ever got tired of floating. Margaret found herself responding, engaging with his childish observations in a way she'd forgotten was possible. The morning passed peacefully. They ate cookies warm from the oven. Margaret taught Samuel a clapping game her mother had taught her. He showed her how he could count to 10 and say his whole name, Samuel David Cross, without any help. Normal things. Safe things. The kind of domestic tranquility that Margaret had convinced herself she'd never want again. But as midday approached and Daniel still hadn't returned, Margaret's unease began to grow. Town was 8 miles south, 2 hours there, time to conduct business, 2 hours back. He should have been returning by now. She kept her worry from Samuel, maintaining a calm facade while her mind ran through increasingly dark scenarios. The men from last night finding him on the road, his horse going lame, an accident, confrontation in town, each possibility worse than the last. Miss Maigret? Samuel's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Why do you keep looking out the window? Just checking the weather, sweetheart, making sure the rain stays away. Papa's late? The child was more perceptive than she'd given him credit for. A little, but I'm sure he's fine. Sometimes business takes longer than expected. Samuel accepted this explanation and returned to playing with the wooden blocks Margaret had found in the storage room, remnants from when James was small. But his periodic glances toward the door told her he felt the absence too, that childhood awareness that something wasn't quite right, even if you couldn't name what. Another hour passed, then another. The afternoon sun was westering when Margaret finally heard it, hoofbeats approaching fast. Too fast. She moved to the window with her rifle in hand, her heart hammering, ready to defend or flee, depending on who appeared. But it was Daniel on the chestnut mare, riding hard toward the cabin. Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely she had to lean against the wall for support. Then she saw his face as he drew closer, saw the tension in his body, and her relief transformed into fresh worry. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and strode toward the cabin. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. What happened? We need to talk. His eyes flicked to Samuel. Privately. Margaret nodded and called to Samuel. Sweetheart, can you play in Miss Margaret's bedroom for a few minutes? I'll come get you soon. But Papa just got back and... I know. We just need to have a grown-up conversation first. I promise it won't be long. Samuel reluctantly obeyed, trudging toward the bedroom with dragging feet. Once the door closed behind him, Daniel turned to Margaret with an expression that made her stomach drop. Those men last night, they weren't from Missouri. They're locals, hired by someone, near as I could tell from gossip in town. He ran a hand through his hair, agitation clear in every movement. Margaret, I think I've brought trouble to your door. Real trouble. Tell me everything. Daniel paced as he spoke, unable to stand still. I sent the wire to my brother. While I was waiting for a response, I went to the general store for supplies. The owner, Henderson, said his name was. He kept looking at me strange. Finally asked if I was passing through or staying. I told him passing through, heading to Thomasville. He got this look on his face and said I should probably move on quickly, that there'd been some men asking around about a traveler with a young boy. The same men from last night? I think so. Henderson described them. Tall one with a mean look, shorter one with a scar. But here's the thing, Margaret. They told people they were looking for a criminal, said I'd kidnapped a child, that I was dangerous. They showed some kind of official-looking document, though Henderson said it seemed suspicious. Margaret felt cold spread through her chest. They're trying to make you look like the criminal, so if they take Samuel, people will think they're doing the right thing, rescuing a kidnapped child from a dangerous man. Daniel's voice was bitter. It's clever, cruel, but clever. My brother-in-law always was smart in the worst ways. You're certain it's him? The wire I got back from my brother confirmed it. He said William, my brother-in-law, had been asking around Thomasville about whether anyone had seen us. When my brother denied knowing our whereabouts, William apparently said he had resources and would find us himself. Resources meaning hired men willing to lie and terrorize. Exactly. Daniel stopped pacing and faced her directly. Margaret, I need to leave. Tonight. Now. I can't bring this down on you. You've done more than anyone could ask, but this isn't your fight. Where will you go? I don't know. Further west, maybe. Somewhere William can't reach. Somewhere. You'll run forever? Margaret heard her voice rise. You'll spend Samuel's entire childhood looking over your shoulder, never settling, never letting him have a home or friends or stability. That's not living, Daniel. That's just a different kind of death. What choice do I have? If I stay anywhere long enough, he'll find me. He'll use the law, use these hired thugs, use whatever it takes. And he's got money. I don't. I can't fight him in court, can't prove that Samuel is better off with me than with blood relatives who can provide more. So you'll just surrender, let him win by wearing you down. I'm not surrendering. I'm protecting my son the only way I know how. They stared at each other across the cabin, both breathing hard, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them. Margaret's mind raced through options, scenarios, possibilities. She thought about her 5 years of isolation, her determination to never care about anything again, her carefully constructed walls against pain and loss. Then she looked toward the bedroom door where Samuel waited, that sweet child who'd patted her hand and told her she wasn't alone anymore. She thought about Daniel's exhausted face, about the weight he'd been carrying since his wife died, about the fundamental unfairness of a man being hunted for the crime of loving his son. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be, what kind of person she'd been before grief had hollowed her out and fear had rebuilt her into something smaller, safer, lonelier. No, she said firmly. Daniel blinked. No what? No, you're not leaving tonight. No, you're not running blindly west with no plan, and no, I'm not letting you face this alone. Margaret, you don't understand what you're saying. These men are dangerous. William is relentless. If you help me, if they find out, let me finish. Margaret crossed to him, standing close enough that he had to look directly into her eyes. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay here. All three of us are. Together. We're going to make it look like you left. You'll ride out publicly, make sure people see you heading west. But you'll circle back after dark. Meanwhile, I'll go into town tomorrow and let it be known that you already moved on, that I was just providing temporary shelter during the storm. We'll lay low for a few weeks, let William's men waste time following false trails. And then what? Hide here forever? No, then we get documentation proving Samuel is legally your son. We find a lawyer, a good one, and we fight this properly. William's using money and lies to hunt you. We'll use truth and law to stop him. It won't be quick, but it'll be right. Daniel shook his head slowly. You can't get involved in this. It's not your... It became my responsibility the moment I opened that door and let you in, Margaret interrupted. Maybe before that, the moment I saw a child who needed help and couldn't turn away. You want to protect Samuel? Then stop running and start fighting, and let someone help you for once. Why? The word came out raw, desperate. Why would you risk yourself for people you barely know? Margaret thought about that question, really thought about it. She could claim practicality or Christian duty or simple human decency. All of those would be partly true, but the real answer was more complicated and more simple at the same time. Because I'm tired of being afraid, she said quietly. I've spent 5 years hiding from life because I was terrified of losing anything else. I thought isolation would keep me safe, and it did, in a way. But it also kept me from living. You and Samuel, you walked into my life and reminded me what living actually feels like. It's messy and scary, and I might get hurt again. But for the first time in 5 years, I feel like myself. like the person I was before grief changed me, and I'm not ready to let that go. Daniel's eyes shone with emotion he was clearly trying to control. If this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, but at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have stood together instead of running separately. She managed a small smile. Besides, you promised to fix my fence. Can't have you leaving before the job's done. A laugh burst out of Daniel, despite everything, surprising them both. The fence? Right. Can't abandon my responsibilities there. Exactly. The tension between them shifted, transformed into something that felt like partnership, like possibility. Margaret realized how close they were standing, close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Margaret Hale, Daniel said softly, you are either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most reckless. Can it be both? I suppose it can. He reached out and took her hand, the gesture feeling both natural and momentous. If we're doing this, if we're really making a stand, I need you to understand what you're facing. William Brennan is not a good man. He's charming to people who matter, ruthless to people who don't. He'll use every weapon he has, including public opinion and legal manipulation. This won't be easy. I didn't expect easy. I expected right. There's a difference. There you go with differences again. I like clarity, remember? They stood there, hands joined, the afternoon light slanting through the windows and painting everything gold. In the bedroom, Samuel began singing to himself, a tuneless, happy sound of a child who felt safe. We should tell him, Daniel said. He deserves to know the plan, at least the parts he can understand. Agreed. They called Samuel out, and he emerged with hopeful eyes. Daniel knelt down to his son's level and explained that they were going to stay with Miss Margaret for a while longer, that they'd have to be very quiet and careful because some bad people were looking for them, but that they were safe here. Samuel listened with the seriousness children sometimes show when they sense something important is happening. When Daniel finished, Samuel turned to Margaret. We're staying? He asked. You're staying, Margaret confirmed. Good. I like it here. It feels like home. The simple statement struck Margaret with devastating force. Home. This cabin that had been a tomb for her memories, a fortress against feeling, had somehow transformed into something that felt like home to this child. And maybe, she realized, to her too. That evening, they executed their plan. Daniel rode out publicly just before sunset, making sure to be seen heading west on the main road. Margaret watched from the window as he disappeared into the dusk, and for a terrible moment she wondered if this was a mistake, if she'd just convinced him to do something that would get them all hurt, or worse. But an hour after full dark, she heard the soft sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Daniel had circled wide and come back as promised. He put the horse in the small barn behind the cabin and slipped inside through the back door. Anyone see you? I don't think so. I stayed well away from the roads on the return trip. He looked exhausted, but relieved. Tomorrow, when you go to town, I'll make it clear you're gone, that I have no idea where you headed and no interest in helping anyone find you. They settled in for the night with new arrangements. Margaret gave up her bedroom to Daniel and Samuel. It had a window that faced the back in case they needed to escape quickly, while she made up the cot in the main room. She was a light sleeper anyway, and this position let her guard the front door. But sleep proved elusive despite her exhaustion. She lay in the darkness listening to the night sounds, crickets, the distant call of an owl, the soft breathing from the bedroom. Her mind replayed the events of the past few days like shuffling cards, trying to understand how she'd gone from solitary to suddenly responsible for two other lives. Somewhere around midnight, she heard the bedroom door creak open. Soft footsteps approached, and then Daniel's voice came out of the darkness. Margaret? You awake? Yes? Can I sit? She moved over on the narrow cot, and he settled on the edge, careful to maintain proper distance. For a while they just sat in companionable silence, two people keeping vigil in the dark. I keep thinking about what you said, Daniel finally spoke. About being tired of being afraid. About choosing to live instead of just survive. Having second thoughts about my advice? No, just wondering when I stopped living, when survival became the only goal. He was quiet for a moment. After Rebecca died, that was my wife's name, Rebecca, I went through the motions, fed Sam, changed him, kept him alive. But I wasn't present, not really. I was too busy grieving, too busy feeling guilty that I was alive. And she wasn't. It wasn't until we started this journey that I began to feel anything again. And now? Now I'm terrified. But I'm also awake, aware. I care about what happens, not just to Sam, but to myself, to you. She felt him turn toward her in the darkness. You gave me that, Margaret. By opening your door, by letting us stay, by deciding to help us fight. You reminded me that caring about the outcome is what makes us human. Margaret's throat tightened. You did the same for me. I thought I wanted to be alone forever, thought it was safer. But these past days, having you and Samuel here, it's like waking up from a long sleep. Sometimes painful, but ultimately necessary. So what do we do with this awakening? Daniel asked softly. After we deal with William, after Samuel is safe, and we don't have to hide anymore, what then? It was the question Margaret had been avoiding, the one that implied a future beyond this immediate crisis. What happened when danger passed? Would Daniel and Samuel move on to Thomasville as planned? Would they stay here? Would she find herself alone again in this cabin, return to her routines but unable to forget what it felt like to have people to care for? I don't know, she admitted. I can't think past keeping you safe right now. That's fair. Daniel stood to return to the bedroom, but paused. Margaret, whatever happens, I want you to know, these days here have been the closest I've felt to home since Rebecca died. That's not a small thing, it's everything, really. So thank you, for all of it. He was gone before she could respond, the bedroom door closing softly behind him. Margaret lay back down, but her mind was more awake than ever, turning over his words. Home. That word again. Simple, but profound. She thought about Samuel's innocent declaration earlier. It feels like home. She thought about Daniel's admission just now. She thought about her own growing reluctance to imagine them leaving, to picture this cabin empty and silent again. Somewhere in the past few days, between the fever and the storm and the danger and the everyday moments of shared meals and simple companionship, 3 separate people had started becoming something more. Not quite a family, that word felt too large, too presumptuous. But something that resembled family in its basic shape, something that mattered in ways that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Morning would bring its challenges. She'd have to ride into town and lie convincingly, play the part of a woman who'd provided temporary shelter and nothing more. She'd have to face potential questions from neighbors she'd been avoiding for years. She'd have to be strong enough for all 3 of them. But tonight, in the darkness with 2 people sleeping peacefully under her roof, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Not quite happiness, that was still too foreign, too fragile, but something that might, with time and care and courage, grow into happiness. Purpose, maybe. Or meaning. Or simply the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd chosen connection over isolation, chosen to fight rather than hide, chosen to care despite the risk. She'd opened her door to strangers asking for one night. Now, somehow, she was fighting to give all of them, a chance at forever. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd built this isolated life to protect herself from loss. And now she was risking everything she'd built for people she'd known less than a week. But as sleep finally claimed her, Margaret realized she didn't regret the choice. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever dangers they still faced, she'd chosen to live instead of merely survive. And that made all the difference. Margaret rose before dawn, her body moving through the motions of preparation while her mind rehearsed the lies she'd need to tell. She dressed carefully in her most respectable clothes, the dark blue dress she wore for town trips, her good boots, her hair pinned neatly. She needed to look like a woman who had nothing to hide, no reason for anyone to question her story. Daniel emerged from the bedroom as she was finishing her coffee, his face showing he'd slept as poorly as she had. They didn't speak much, both understanding that words wouldn't ease the tension of what lay ahead. Samuel remained asleep, exhausted from the previous day's excitement, and they decided to let him rest. Remember, Daniel said quietly as Margaret prepared to leave, you're just a woman who showed charity to travelers. You don't know where I went, don't care, and you're glad to have your peace and quiet back. I understand how lying works, Daniel. I know, He reached out and took her hand. Be careful. If they suspect you're protecting us, if they push, they won't. I've lived alone out here for 5 years. People think I'm strange anyway, too private, too isolated. It'll make sense that I'd want strangers gone as quickly as possible. That's not who you are, though. Margaret looked at him directly. It's who I was until you knocked on my door, but they don't know that. They'll believe what they expect to see. She rode the chestnut mare into town, arriving mid-morning when the general store would be busy enough that her presence wouldn't seem unusual, but not so crowded that she couldn't have the conversation she needed. Henderson was behind the counter when she entered, and his eyes widened slightly at seeing her. Miss Hale, didn't expect you for another week or so. Supplies ran low faster than planned, Margaret said evenly, pulling out her list. Had unexpected visitors during the storm. They ate through more than I anticipated. She said it loud enough that several other customers could hear, establishing her story before anyone could ask. Henderson's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in that way people did when they wanted information but didn't want to appear nosy. The man and boy folks have been asking about? He asked, keeping his tone casual as he gathered her supplies. I suppose so. He showed up during the worst of the heat. Child was fevered. I gave them shelter through the storm, some food and water. They left yesterday heading west. Margaret paused, then added with just the right amount of annoyance. Honestly, I was glad to see them go. I'm not accustomed to company anymore, and a small child is exhausting. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she saw several people nodding in understanding. A woman nearby, Mrs. Patterson, Margaret remembered, wife of a rancher to the east, spoke up. Can't say I blame you. Children are a blessing, but they do require patience. Her eyes were curious. The man didn't say where he was heading specifically? He mentioned family in California, I think. Or maybe Colorado. I wasn't paying close attention. Margaret shrugged. He seemed eager to keep moving, and I was eager to have my home back. We didn't exchange life stories. Henderson finished gathering her supplies, and Margaret noticed him watching her face carefully. He was smarter than she'd given him credit for, she realized. He might suspect she wasn't telling the whole truth. But suspicion wasn't proof, and as long as she maintained her story consistently, there was nothing he could do. Those men who came through yesterday, Henderson said as he tallied her bill. They seemed mighty interested in finding that traveler, said he was dangerous, that the child might be in harm. Did they? Margaret kept her voice disinterested. Well, the child seemed healthy enough by the time they left. Fever broke, appetite returned. If the man was dangerous, he certainly didn't show it to me, just a tired father trying to get his son somewhere safe. You didn't think it odd, him traveling alone with such a young child? I didn't think much about it at all, Mr. Henderson. I provided Christian charity, they recovered, they left. That's the beginning and end of the story. Margaret met his eyes steadily. Why? Are those men claiming otherwise? No, ma'am. Just curious is all. Margaret paid for her supplies and was preparing to leave when the door opened and 2 men entered. Her heart seized in her chest before her mind caught up. These weren't the same men from the other night. These were strangers, travel-worn but with a different energy. One was older, maybe 50, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. The younger one stayed near the door, his hand resting casually near his belt, where Margaret could see a badge pinned. Law enforcement. Real or fake? She couldn't tell yet. Pardon me, the older man said, his voice carrying authority. I'm looking for a woman named Margaret Hale. Every instinct screamed at Margaret to run, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm Margaret Hale. The man's expression shifted slightly, reassessing her. I'm Samuel Brennan. I believe you recently gave shelter to my nephew and his father. The room went silent. Everyone was watching now, and Margaret understood with cold clarity that this was the moment everything could unravel. This was William's brother, which meant he was Daniel's brother-in-law, which meant he had a legitimate claim to know about Samuel's whereabouts. I gave shelter to a man and child during the storm, Margaret said carefully. I don't know their names. They didn't volunteer much information, and I didn't ask. But they were here. You admit that much. I admit I provided temporary shelter to travelers in need. That's not a crime, is it, Mr. Brennan? Of course not. His smile didn't reach his eyes. But I'm concerned about my nephew's welfare. His father, Daniel Cross, has been unstable since my sister's death. We're worried he's not capable of providing proper care. The child seemed fine to me. And you're an expert on child welfare? The condescension in his tone made Margaret's spine stiffen. I'm a woman who raised 2 children of her own. I know a sick child from a healthy one, a frightened child from a content one. The boy I sheltered was neither sick nor frightened by his father. Samuel Brennan's expression hardened. When did they leave? Yesterday, late afternoon. Where were they heading? West, that's all I know. You didn't ask for more details? Most people would be curious about strangers staying under their roof. Most people aren't me, Mr. Brennan. I value my privacy and extend that courtesy to others. They needed help, I provided it, they moved on. That's the extent of our interaction. The younger man by the door spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, if you're hiding them, if you know where they are, you could be charged with obstruction. Aiding someone who's potentially kidnapped a child is a serious crime. Potentially kidnapped? Margaret's voice rose slightly, genuinely angry now. That man is the child's father. I saw the way they were together, the love, the care. If you're suggesting he kidnapped his own son, you'll need to provide evidence beyond wild accusations. The evidence is that he fled Missouri against the family's wishes, taking the child away from relatives who have the means to provide better care, Samuel Brennan interjected. We have legal counsel preparing papers to contest his custody. Once we find them. Then I suggest you look west, Mr. Brennan, because I don't know anything beyond what I've already told you. Margaret gathered her supplies. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a long ride home. She made it to the door before Samuel Brennan spoke again. Miss Hale, a word of advice. If Daniel Cross contacts you, if he tries to come back seeking shelter, you should turn him away. For your own protection. This situation is more complicated than you understand, and you don't want to find yourself on the wrong side of the law. Margaret turned to face him. Mr. Brennan, I've lived alone on the plains for 5 years. I've survived droughts and storms and every hardship this land can throw at me. I'm not afraid of complications, and I'm not in the habit of turning away people in genuine need. If your nephew's father ever does return, which I doubt, I'll make my own decisions about what's right and wrong, not based on threats or intimidation, but on what I see with my own eyes. Good day. She walked out before he could respond, keeping her pace steady and unhurried, even though her heart was racing. She loaded her supplies onto the horse with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, mounted up, and rode out of town at a normal pace. Only when she was a mile out, certain no one had followed, did she allow herself to exhale fully. The confrontation had been dangerous, but also clarifying. Samuel Brennan wasn't just William's brother. He was part of the plan to take Samuel away from Daniel. The mention of legal counsel meant they were building a case, preparing to use courts and law to achieve what threats and hired thugs couldn't. But they didn't know where Daniel was. They suspected Margaret might be lying, but they had no proof. As long as she and Daniel were careful, as long as they maintained the deception, they had time to prepare their own defense. The ride home felt longer than usual, every shadow making her jump, every sound potentially meaning danger. But she arrived without incident to find Daniel watching from the window, relief flooding his face when he saw her. They were there, she said without preamble as she dismounted. Your brother-in-law's brother, Samuel Brennan. And someone who might have been a marshal, though I couldn't tell if the badge was real. Daniel's face went pale. What did you tell them? The truth, mostly. That you'd stayed during the storm and left heading west yesterday. That I didn't know your names or destination. That the child seemed healthy and well cared for. Margaret carried her supplies inside. They're preparing legal action, custody papers. They mentioned lawyers. Then we need lawyers too, better ones. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. My brother in Thomasville. He knows a good attorney, but I can't contact him without potentially leading William straight to us. Then we wait. We stay hidden for a few weeks, let them chase ghosts west. Meanwhile, we gather what documentation you have proving Samuel is your son, proving you're fit to care for him. When the time is right, we go on the offensive instead of just defending. Samuel emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Miss Maigret, you're back! He ran to her with arms outstretched, and Margaret found herself kneeling to catch him, pulling him into a hug that felt as natural as breathing. Over his head, her eyes met Daniel's, and she saw the fear there, the uncertainty, but also something else. Trust. He trusted her with his son's safety, with their future, with his heart. The weight of that trust settled on her shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. She'd forgotten what it felt like to matter this much to someone, to have people depending on her not just for shelter, but for everything that came with home and family. The next weeks established a new rhythm. Daniel remained hidden, venturing outside only at night to help with chores. During the day, Margaret maintained her routines, occasionally riding to town for supplies, always projecting the image of a woman who'd returned to her preferred isolation. She heard rumors. Daniel had been spotted in Nevada, or maybe Kansas, definitely heading west with the child. The stories multiplied and contradicted each other, which served their purposes perfectly. Samuel adapted with the resilience children possessed, treating their situation like an extended game of hide and seek. He learned to be quiet during the day, to play in the back rooms where he couldn't be seen from outside, to understand that this secrecy was important even if he didn't fully grasp why. Margaret watched Daniel struggle with the confinement. He was a man accustomed to action, to moving forward, and being trapped in hiding clearly chafed, but he bore it without complaint, channeling his energy into planning for the future, writing down every detail he could remember that might help their case, dates, witnesses, documents. Rebecca's death certificate lists complications from childbirth, he said, one evening as they sat at the table after Samuel had gone to bed. That proves the family's claim that I caused her death is unfounded. I also have our marriage certificate, Samuel's birth certificate showing I'm his father, letters from neighbors in Missouri attesting to my character. That's a start. What about proof that you can provide for him? I have a trade, carpentry. I can show earnings, references from previous employers. My brother's offer of work in Thomasville is documented in his letters. Daniel looked up from his papers. But is it enough? William has money, social standing, family connections. What do I have besides love for my son? Love counts for something. It has to. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. We'll make it count. Their hands remained joined, and the moment stretched into something more than simple reassurance. Daniel's thumb traced small circles on her palm, the gesture so intimate that Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Margaret, he said softly, I need to know something. When this is over, when Samuel is safe and we don't have to hide anymore, do you want us to leave? The question hung between them, demanding honesty. Margaret thought about her answer carefully. A month ago, she would have said yes without hesitation, would have been counting the days until her solitude returned. But now, the thought of this cabin empty again, silent again, felt unbearable. No, she whispered. I don't want you to leave. What do you want? I don't know exactly. I just know that these past weeks, having you here, having Samuel, it's felt right in a way nothing has felt since I lost my family. I'm not saying I know what we're building or where it goes, but I'm saying I want to find out. Daniel's eyes reflected lamplight and something deeper. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of love. I'm falling for you, Margaret Hale. I've been trying not to because the timing is terrible and the situation is impossible, but I can't seem to help it. Margaret's breath caught. Daniel, you don't have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens, you've given me more than shelter. You've given me hope that life can be good again, that I can be more than just a father in survival mode, that Samuel can have a home and I can have happiness, partnership, whatever this is between us. It scares me, Margaret admitted, caring again, opening myself up to loss. I spent 5 years protecting myself from exactly this. I know. It scares me too. Daniel squeezed her hand. But I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of running, physically and emotionally. I want to stand still. I want to build something. I want to see what happens if we're brave enough to try. Before Margaret could respond, a sound outside froze them both. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching fast. Daniel was on his feet instantly, blowing out the lamp and moving to the window. 4 riders, he whispered, coming straight here. Margaret's mind raced. Get Samuel, the root cellar, now. What about you? I'll handle this. Go. Daniel disappeared into the bedroom while Margaret grabbed her rifle and positioned herself behind the door. She heard him wake Samuel gently, heard the back door open and close as they made their escape to the hidden cellar. She was alone now, 1 woman against 4 men, and she felt the fear but also something stronger, fierce determination that they would not take her family, not without a fight. The horses stopped outside, and heavy footsteps approached the porch. A fist pounded on the door. Margaret Hale, open up. We know you're in there. She recognized the voice. Samuel Brennan. He'd come back, and he'd brought reinforcements. Margaret's finger found the trigger of her rifle as she called out, It's late, Mr. Brennan. State your business or leave my property. We have a warrant to search these premises. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive. I'm harboring no one. I'm alone, as I've been for years. You have no right. The door burst open, the lock giving way under force. Margaret raised the rifle, aiming at Samuel Brennan's chest as he entered with 3 other men behind him. Don't move, she said, her voice deadly calm. Samuel Brennan stopped, but his expression was confident, not afraid. You're not going to shoot me, Miss Hale. You're a decent woman who wouldn't commit murder. Try me. Where is he? Where's Daniel Cross? I told you before. He left weeks ago. I don't know where he went. We don't believe you, Samuel Brennan gestured to his men. Search the house. Every room, every closet, every hiding place. You have no legal right. We have all the right we need. My nephew is in danger with an unstable father, and we have evidence that you've been aiding him. Samuel produced papers from his coat. This is a writ of custody, signed by a judge in Missouri. Samuel David Cross is to be remanded to the care of his maternal relatives. If you interfere, you'll be charged with obstruction and possibly kidnapping. Margaret's heart pounded as the men tore through her cabin. They searched the bedroom, pulled everything from closets, even checked under the floorboards. They searched for 20 minutes while she stood with rifle raised, and Samuel Brennan watched with smug satisfaction. Finally, one of the men returned. Nothing, sir. No sign of them. Samuel's expression darkened. They were here. I know they were here. Think whatever you want, Margaret said, but you've torn apart my home for nothing. Now get out. This isn't over, Samuel said, moving toward the door. We'll be watching this place. If he comes back, if you try to contact him, we'll know. And when we find him, and we will, you'll face charges for your part in this. They left finally, riding off into the darkness. Margaret waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before setting down the rifle and running to the back of the cabin. She opened the hidden cellar door to find Daniel and Samuel huddled in the darkness below. They're gone, she said. You can come up. Daniel climbed out first, then lifted Samuel up. The child was crying silently, frightened by the shouting and violence. Margaret pulled him into her arms while Daniel checked the cabin, assessing the damage. They really did tear the place apart, he said grimly. I'm sorry, Margaret. I brought this down on you. No, William brought this down on all of us. Margaret held Samuel close, feeling his small body tremble. But they didn't find you. That's what matters. They'll be back, or they'll watch the place. We can't stay here anymore. Then we leave. Tonight. We ride to Thomasville to your brother, and we face this head on. No more hiding. Margaret, that's exactly what they want. They'll follow us. Let them. Let them see us riding together openly. Let them know we're not afraid anymore. Let them try to take Samuel in broad daylight with witnesses around. Margaret's voice was fierce. We find your brother's lawyer. We file our own custody papers. We force this into a courtroom where truth matters more than money. We fight, Daniel, on our terms, not theirs. Daniel stared at her, something like awe in his expression. You're sure? I'm sure. I'm done hiding. I'm done being passive. I'm done letting fear make my decisions. She looked down at Samuel, who'd stopped crying and was watching her with those serious eyes. Someone tried to take you tonight, sweetheart. But do you know what we're going to do? What, Miss Margaret? We're going to make sure that never ever happens. Because you belong with your papa, and nobody has the right to take you away from someone who loves you that much. Do you understand? Samuel nodded solemnly. We're a family? The word hung in the air. Margaret looked at Daniel, saw the question and hope in his eyes, felt the weight of the child in her arms and the choice before her. She could still back away, could help them escape and return to her isolation, could protect herself from the risk of loss. Or she could step forward into the terrifying, beautiful unknown of belonging again. Yes, she heard herself say, we're a family. They rode out an hour later, 3 people on 2 horses heading east toward Thomasville through the darkness. They rode carefully but not secretly, no longer trying to hide. If someone was watching, let them see. Let them report back to William that Daniel Cross was moving with purpose, accompanied by a woman and his son, heading toward legal help rather than running away. Dawn found them on the outskirts of Thomasville. Daniel led them to a modest house on the edge of town where his brother Thomas lived. The reunion was emotional. Thomas had been sick with worry about Daniel and Samuel, and he welcomed them all with relief and immediate offers of help. There's a lawyer here, James Crawford, Thomas said once they'd settled. He's good, honest, and he hates seeing people bullied by those with more money. I'll take you to him this morning. Crawford's office was small but orderly, and the man himself inspired confidence. 60 years old with keen eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen everything. He listened to their story without interruption, asked pointed questions, and examined the documents Daniel had brought. You have a strong case, he said finally. You're the biological father, you've been the primary caregiver since your wife's death, and there's no evidence of unfitness. The fact that they've resorted to hired thugs and intimidation actually helps us, shows they know they can't win on merit alone. Can you stop them from taking Samuel? Daniel asked. I can file an injunction preventing any custody changes until a hearing is held. I can subpoena witnesses to testify about your character and parenting. I can make this expensive and public for the Brennan family, which they won't want. Crawford leaned back in his chair. But you need to understand, this will be a fight. They have resources. It could take months. I don't care how long it takes, Daniel said firmly. I'm not running anymore. And you, Miss Hale? Crawford turned to Margaret. Your involvement complicates things. They could try to paint you as an inappropriate influence, a woman of questionable morals harboring a man she wasn't married to. Margaret felt her face heat but kept her voice steady. My morals are none of their concern. I helped people in need. That's not a crime. No, but they'll use it against you if they can. Crawford's expression was kind but realistic. I'm not judging you. I'm telling you what we're up against. Then let them come, Margaret said. I've spent 5 years caring too much about what people thought, letting their judgment keep me isolated. I'm done with that. These 2 people matter more to me than public opinion. Crawford nodded slowly. Then we proceed. I'll file papers today. Daniel, you and Samuel will stay in Thomasville where I can reach you easily. Miss Hale, you're welcome to stay as well, though returning to your property might be smarter from an optics perspective. Shows you have your own life, your own concerns beyond this situation. I'll stay, Margaret said without hesitation. They've already torn apart my home looking for Daniel. Returning alone won't change anyone's opinion of me. I'd rather be here where I can help. The legal proceedings began that day. Crawford filed for custody confirmation, submitted evidence of Daniel's parenting, gathered affidavits from neighbors in Missouri who'd witnessed his dedication to Samuel. He also filed charges against the men who'd broken into Margaret's home, forcing the Brennans to defend their own actions. The battle played out over 6 weeks. The Brennans brought in expensive lawyers who painted Daniel as unstable, grieving, unable to provide proper stability. They claimed Samuel needed the advantages their family could offer: private education, social connections, financial security. Crawford countered by putting Daniel on the stand, letting the court see his love for his son, his steadiness, his plans for the future. He brought witnesses who testified about the care Daniel provided, the bond between father and son. He showed records proving Daniel's employment history, his ability to support himself and Samuel. And then he called Margaret to the stand. She was terrified as she swore to tell the truth, faced a courtroom full of people judging her every word and movement. The Brennan's lawyer attacked immediately. Miss Hale, isn't it true you lived alone for 5 years before meeting Mr. Cross? Yes. And isn't it true you allowed an unmarried man to stay in your home, alone with you, for weeks. I provided shelter to a father and sick child. The circumstances were innocent. Were they? Or did you see an opportunity, a lonely widow, a widowed man, a ready-made family to fill the void in your life? Margaret felt anger rise but kept her voice calm. I saw a child who needed help and a father who was trying to protect his son from people who wanted to take him away for selfish reasons. I chose to help because it was the right thing to do. The right thing, or what you wanted? The lawyer's tone was mocking. Convenient, isn't it, that helping them also gave you companionship, purpose, perhaps even romantic prospects? My motivations aren't on trial here, Margaret said firmly. Samuel's welfare is, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that he is better off with his father who loves him than with relatives who view him as a possession to be claimed. The lawyer tried to push further, but Crawford objected and the judge sustained it. Margaret left the stand shaking but feeling like she'd held her ground. The case took another turn when the judge interviewed Samuel privately. The child was young, but even at 2 years old, his preferences mattered. When he emerged from the judge's chambers and ran straight to Daniel, wrapping his small arms around his father's legs, the message was clear. The ruling came on a Tuesday afternoon. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the case, and people were invested in the outcome. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, reviewed her notes before speaking. I've considered all evidence and testimony carefully. This is a case that required me to weigh multiple factors: financial resources versus emotional bonds, stability versus love, what the law requires versus what the child needs. Margaret held her breath. Beside her, Daniel gripped Samuel tightly. The court finds that Daniel Cross is a fit and loving father who has demonstrated both capability and dedication to his son's welfare. While the Brennan family can offer financial advantages, money alone does not make a proper home. The bond between father and son is evident and strong. The court sees no reason to disrupt that bond. Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely she felt dizzy. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court notes with disapproval the tactics employed by the Brennan family, hiring men to harass and intimidate, breaking into private property, using legal papers as weapons rather than tools for justice. Such behavior suggests their interest lies more in winning than in the child's actual welfare. She looked directly at William Brennan, who sat rigid in the front row. Custody remains with Daniel Cross. The Brennan family may petition for supervised visitation rights if they wish, but they will have no decision-making authority over Samuel's upbringing. This court's ruling is final. The gavel came down, and Daniel burst into tears, clutching Samuel close. Margaret found herself pulled into their embrace, the three of them holding each other as relief and joy overwhelmed everything else. Outside the courthouse, Crawford shook their hands. You won. More importantly, you won decisively. They can't appeal this without new evidence, and there isn't any. Samuel is yours, Daniel, legally and permanently. Thank you, Daniel managed through tears. Thank you for believing us. Thank you for being worth believing in, Crawford replied with a smile. They celebrated that night at Thomas's house, a simple dinner that felt like the finest feast. Samuel was giddy with the adults' happiness, even if he didn't fully understand what had happened. Margaret watched him play, watched Daniel finally relax for the first time in months, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 5 years. Peace. Not the empty silence of isolation, but the genuine peace of belonging, of fighting for something and winning, of choosing connection over safety and finding it was worth every risk. Later, after Samuel had fallen asleep and Thomas had retired to his own room, Daniel and Margaret sat on the porch in the warm summer darkness. What happens now? Margaret asked softly. Now we get to decide our future instead of just reacting to threats. Daniel took her hand. I was thinking, Thomasville seems like a good place. Thomas says there's work, good schools for when Sam gets older. Maybe we could stay, build something permanent. Or, Margaret said carefully, we could go back to the cabin, fix it up properly, make it a real home instead of just a shelter. Daniel turned to look at her. You'd want that? After everything that happened there? I want it because of everything that happened there. That's where we became a family, Daniel. That's where we chose each other. Seems right to build our future where it started. The cabin's isolated, hard work, difficult winters. I know. I've lived there for 5 years. Margaret smiled. But it won't be lonely anymore. It'll be full of life and noise and probably chaos with a growing child. It'll be home. What about us? Daniel asked, his voice hesitant. I meant what I said before. I've fallen for you, Margaret, but I haven't asked properly what you want from this, from us. Margaret thought about her answer. A month ago, she couldn't have imagined wanting any of this. A ready-made family, complications, the vulnerability of caring deeply for people who could be taken from her. But she'd learned something in these weeks of fighting and fear and finding courage she'd forgotten she possessed. I want everything, she said simply. I want mornings drinking coffee while Samuel plays at our feet. I want to argue with you about fence repairs and whose turn it is to collect eggs. I want to fall asleep next to you and wake up knowing we chose this life together. I want the messiness and the beauty and the risk of loving people who might leave me someday. Because the alternative, the safety of isolation, isn't actually living. And I'm done just surviving. Daniel's eyes shone in the darkness. Margaret Hale, will you marry me? Will you be Samuel's mother and my wife and let us build a life together in that cabin where you first showed us what home could mean? Yes, Margaret said, and felt the word transform everything. Yes to all of it. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Margaret found herself smiling wider than she had in 5 years. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Thomasville's small church. Thomas stood as Daniel's best man, and the lawyer Crawford gave Margaret away since she had no family present. Samuel, dressed in new clothes and looking impossibly proud, carried the rings on a small pillow. Margaret wore a simple dress, cream-colored, nothing fancy, but she felt beautiful standing beside Daniel, speaking vows that promised partnership and love and commitment to building something lasting together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel cheered so loudly that the whole congregation laughed. They returned to the cabin as a family, Daniel, Margaret, and Samuel Cross, arriving in late afternoon when the summer sun painted everything gold. The place looked different to Margaret now, not a monument to loss, but a foundation for the future. Daniel had already started repairs during their weeks in Thomasville, and more work remained. But standing there with her new husband and son, Margaret felt only excitement for the transformation ahead. They settled into their new life with surprising ease. Daniel completed the fence repairs he'd started months ago, then moved on to expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for Samuel, reinforcing the barn, building a larger chicken coop. Margaret tended her garden with new enthusiasm, planting varieties she'd never tried before, planning for bigger harvests that would feed 3 instead of 1. Samuel thrived in ways that made Margaret's heart ache with joy. He grew taller, stronger, more confident. He helped with chores, learned to gather eggs without breaking them, followed Daniel around asking endless questions about carpentry and farming. He called Margaret Mama without anyone teaching him to, the word appearing naturally one morning at breakfast and staying. The first time he said it, Margaret had to leave the room to cry. Not sad tears, happy tears for the gift of being needed and loved and chosen by this small person who'd walked into her life and changed everything. They had challenges, of course. Winter came hard that first year, testing their preparations and their partnership. Samuel got sick again, just a minor cold, but it sent Margaret into a panic that Daniel had to gently talk her through. They argued about money, about decisions, about the 1,000 small things couples disagreed on when learning to share a life. But they also had moments of profound happiness. Christmas morning, watching Samuel's face light up at the toys Daniel had made. Spring planting with all 3 of them working the garden together. Summer evenings on the porch with Samuel playing while Daniel and Margaret sat close, his arm around her shoulders, both of them watching the sunset paint the plains in colors that never got old. Word spread about their story. The widow who'd taken in strangers and ended up with a family. The father who'd fought the system and won. Some people approved. Others whispered that it had all happened too fast, that Margaret had been improper in housing an unmarried man, that there was something scandalous about the whole situation. Margaret found she didn't care. Let them whisper. She had what mattered: love, purpose, family. The opinions of people who'd let her grieve alone for 5 years meant nothing compared to the daily reality of Samuel's laughter and Daniel's steady presence. On their first anniversary, Daniel gave her a gift, a wooden plaque he'd carved with 3 pairs of shoes sketched into the wood. Beneath them, simple words: "A family is made of people who choose each other." Margaret hung it by the door where everyone could see it, where she could see it every day and remember what she'd learned, that the bravest thing she'd ever done wasn't surviving 5 years alone, but opening that door when Daniel knocked, choosing connection over isolation, choosing to live instead of merely existing. Sometimes, late at night when the cabin was quiet and Samuel slept peacefully in his room, Margaret would lie beside Daniel and marvel at the journey that had brought them here. A desperate knock in the heat of summer, a fevered child, a storm that had trapped them together, danger that had forced them to stand united, legal battles that had tested their resolve, and through it all, the slow, surprising blooming of love. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked her one of those nights. "Letting us stay, choosing this complicated, chaotic life?" Margaret thought about her answer. She thought about the 5 years of silence before they came. She thought about the woman she'd been, safe but hollow, protected but alone, surviving but not living. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "You and Samuel didn't interrupt my life. You gave it back to me. Even with all the difficulties, the judgment from others, the fear we went through, especially because of those things. They reminded me I'm alive, Daniel, that I'm capable of fighting for what matters, that love is worth the risk of loss." She turned to face him in the darkness. "I spent 5 years trying to avoid pain by avoiding connection, but that's not actually living, that's just waiting to die. You and Samuel taught me the difference." Daniel pulled her close, and they lay together listening to the night sounds: wind in the grass, crickets chirping, the occasional creak of the house settling. The same sounds Margaret had heard alone for 5 years, but they meant something different now. Not isolation, but peace. Not loneliness, but contentment. Not an ending, but a beginning that kept unfolding with each new day. Summer stretched on, bringing its familiar heat but no longer feeling oppressive. 3 pairs of shoes rested by the cabin door: Daniel's worn boots, Margaret's sturdy work shoes, Samuel's small ones that would need replacing soon as he continued to grow. Evidence of presence, of life, of family. Margaret never named what they'd become beyond that simple word. They weren't trying to replace what each had lost: Daniel's first wife, Margaret's first family. They were building something new from the pieces of their broken pasts, creating a future that honored what came before while embracing what existed now. The cabin that had been a tomb for memories became a home for living. The woman who'd chosen isolation learned to choose connection. The man who'd been running found a place to stand still, and the child who'd needed healing found a mother's love in unexpected places. They weren't perfect. Life wasn't easy. The plains remained harsh, winters stayed cold, and challenges continued to appear. But they faced everything together, 3 people who'd found each other through desperate circumstances and chosen to build something lasting from that foundation. Years later, when Samuel was older and asked about how his family had formed, Margaret would tell him the truth, that sometimes the most important moments in life come from unexpected knocks on unlikely doors. That courage means opening yourself to possibility even when every instinct screams to stay safe. That family isn't always about blood, but about who shows up when you need them, who stays when things get hard, who chooses you every single day. She would tell him about the summer she learned to live again, about the stranger with a baby who'd asked for one night and stayed for forever, about the choice between safety and connection, between surviving and living, between isolation and love. And she would tell him that of all the decisions she'd made in her life, opening that door when his father knocked was the one she'd never, ever regret. Because it had given her everything that mattered. It had given her home, it had given her family, it had given her life itself. The story didn't have a perfect ending because real life never does. But it had a true one. 3 people who found each other when they needed it most, who fought for the right to stay together, who built a life from courage and hope and stubborn determination to believe that love was worth the risk. And on summer evenings, when the 3 of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Margaret would think about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, alone, afraid, convinced that isolation was her only path forward. She would think about that woman with compassion, but also with gratitude for everything she'd learned since. That woman had survived. But this woman, the one with calloused hands and laugh lines and a husband beside her and a son at her feet, this woman was finally, beautifully, completely alive. The plains stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving and utterly breathtaking. The same landscape that had witnessed her grief now held her joy. The same cabin that had sheltered her solitude now rang with love and laughter and life. And Margaret Hale Cross, who had once lived alone for years until a stranger with a baby knocked on her door, sat surrounded by her chosen family and knew with absolute certainty that she'd found her way home at last.